Criminology is a true crime podcast that may contain discussion about violent or disturbing topics. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 398 of the Criminology podcast. I'm Mike Ferguson.
And this is Mike Morford.
Mr. Morford, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing pretty good. How you doing this week?
I'm having a good week. Busy, but really good.
What's keeping you busy?
Well, I don't know if I've talked about it on this podcast, but Gibby and I decided to put a second episode out on True Crime All the Time. So we got a little bit more work, and we're doing some video too. So that's what I've been up to.
I had a little bit of a down week actually, but my wife was away doing some work stuff, so I had the kids here and trying to get everything done by myself, and realize how hard a job that is. So, I'm always thankful for my wife for the job she does. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, tough being a single parent. Let's go ahead and give our Patreon shout outs. We had Madison Cox and Karen Gilly. So great new support. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for that support. It really helps out the show. For anyone else that wants to help out, go to patreon.com/criminology to get started.
All right, Morph, let's go ahead and jump into this week's case, or should I say cases? Valentine's Day just passed, and hopefully everyone listening enjoyed their day. Maybe they spent time with their significant other, had a romantic evening. Valentine's Day is traditionally a special day. It's filled with love and happy memories, but not all of the time. And in this episode, we're talking about the murders of Jodi, Serrin, and Carolyn Eaton. Their murders are unrelated, but there's a common theme, and that is Valentine's Day. One was killed on Valentine's Day, and the other person's body was found on Valentine's Day. And, their deaths left their families heartbroken. And so for them, Valentine's Day will never be the same again. And, we do, unfortunately, have to discuss murders that occur around the holidays. And one thing that I can't help but think about is, what happens then to that holiday? How does it change? Because obviously, it does. And it doesn't have to be a murder. Some people have a person who unfortunately passes away around a specific holiday. And even something like that can change that holiday forever.
In 2007, 39-year-old Jodi Elizabeth Serrin, or Jodi as she was known to most people, was living in Carlsbad, which is just north of San Diego, California. Jodi's been described as mentally disabled, but still high-functioning. Only one article noted that she suffered from schizophrenia. According to her mother, Lois, in an interview with NBC7 San Diego, she did really well, but life could be a struggle for her at times. Though Jodi needed support, she was able to live independently in a ground-floor condo unit that her parents helped her get. It wasn't too far from their own home, so it was nice for them to have that peace of mind that even though Jodi was on her own, she was still close.
On Valentine's Day 2007, Jodi's parents, Arthur and Lois, couldn't get in touch with her. They spoke on the phone often to make sure she was okay, to help her with things, since she couldn't drive. But that day she wasn't answering, and she hadn't called them back. Around 10 p.m., Arthur and Lois got back from their Valentine's Day date, which was dinner and a movie. Jodi still hadn't returned their calls. It had been almost 24 hours since they had heard from their daughter. They couldn't go to sleep until they knew she was okay. So they went over to her condo to check on her. They knocked, but she didn't come to the door. So they used their key to unlock it. A chain latch was engaged, though. So they still couldn't get in. They could see that the lights were on. Nothing looked out of the ordinary, but it was very concerning that they hadn't heard from Jodi, even if she was asleep or taking a shower at the moment, and just didn't hear them at the door. They just couldn't take the chance that something was wrong. So Arthur actually forced his way in and broke the latch. The commotion from this still didn't make Jodi come to the door to see what was going on.
Arthur made his way into the bedroom, but stopped immediately. He was caught off guard by a man who was in Jodi's room, standing over her, and it looked like he and Jodi were having sex. Understandably, this was awkward for Arthur, and he quickly backed out and went into the living room to wait with Lois. They figured that Jodi and the man, who they assumed must be her boyfriend, or at least romantic interest, would be out when they were dressed. But they waited and waited. Finally, Arthur decided to go back into the room and check on Jodi, since so much time had passed. And in that instant, the situation changed from awkward to dire. When Arthur went back in, the man was gone, and Jodi was lying on the bed, and she was clearly dead. Her parents frantically called 911 and were instructed by the dispatcher to move Jodi to the floor so they could perform CPR. Her father did move her to the floor, but it was no use. It was clear that Jodi had been dead for some time. She was cold to the touch.
And Morf, you and I cover a lot of situations that are hard to imagine putting yourself into. This one, man, I don't know if we've ever talked about anything like this. We've talked many times about strangers, even loved ones, finding someone in their family dead. But, here's a situation where a mother and father are understandably concerned about their daughter. She has special needs, and they haven't heard from her. They most likely talk to her very often, probably every day, but she's not getting back to them. Okay, many parents can probably put themselves in that situation, maybe even the situation of having to bust in because they think something's wrong. Now, oftentimes it turns out that it's nothing, right? But not here.
Yeah, walking in on your daughter in what you think is her having sex, that's got to be one set of emotions, very awkward, embarrassing, but only for it to escalate into a situation where, no, she's not having sex. She's dead. And the man that you just saw in there with her is now missing. So I can't imagine the range of emotions that happened over that short span for these poor parents.
And I think that's the thing that really jumped out at me is, Arthur as the father is very close to this individual, right? As he walks into the room, it couldn't have been that far. Bedrooms aren't that big. So to look at it or think about it after the fact, after you know that your daughter's dead, most likely you were standing right next to her killer or very close to. Arthur and Lois, in shock over what happened, tried to console each other, and the realization quickly set in of what really happened, as we just talked about, right? Art hadn't interrupted his daughter in an intimate moment. He had walked in on his daughter being sexually assaulted long after she was dead. Although Arthur could not have saved Jodi, he was no doubt upset that he could have stopped the man who had murdered her. He told CBS 8, "I would have liked to do it all over again and grab this turkey." He just had no way of knowing at that moment that Jodi was dead. He thought this was an interaction with a boyfriend, and he had stepped back to give them some privacy and not try to stop what was going on. Arthur said, Jodi was 39. It's her life.
Police believe that the killer likely walked right out the front door. The way Jodi's condo was set up, you couldn't see the front door or Jodi's bedroom door from the living room where both of her parents were waiting for her. But in his haste to leave, the man did leave behind a pair of shoes. Jodi insisted that anyone who came inside took their shoes off at the door. In his rush to leave without her parents noticing him, he didn't grab them. This seemed like an indication that perhaps Jodi did know her killer and had invited him in.
Jodi had been visibly beaten by her killer. An autopsy would reveal that she had been strangled and suffered blunt force trauma to her head. There were defensive wounds on her body, indicating that she had been fighting back during the attack. Her neck had been cut, but not deep enough to be fatal, and detectives believed that wound could have been inflicted on Jodi after she was already dead or at the very least unconscious. The medical examiner estimated that Jodi had died around noon that day, about 10 hours before her parents found her. Unidentified male DNA was recovered from Jodi's body and later entered into CODIS, but it didn't match any sample in the database.
Investigators were tasked with trying to figure out who killed Jodi. There were no signs of forced entry other than Arthur breaking the latch to get in. And that's not very surprising since it seemed that Jodi may have known her killer and invited him into the condo. If he had forced his way inside, it's not very likely that he would have also taken off his shoes. This seems to indicate that Jodi was at least comfortable with letting the man inside. We don't know when she invited him in or under what circumstances. It was clear to police that the killer had moved around the apartment freely after Jodi was dead. Based on the estimated time of death, he could have been there for up to 10 hours after the murder. There was blood in multiple spots, one of which was in the bathroom. At least one bloody footprint was left on her carpet. Things had been moved around the condo, too. Her bedding had been used to cover up all of the windows in the room. A full-length mirror had been placed in front of the dresser next to the bed, blocking access to any of the drawers. Investigators believe that her killer had put it there specifically so he could see himself as he assaulted her.
And Morf, we just talked about how shocking this whole thing was. I think it becomes even more so after you find out that Jodi had been dead for approximately 10 hours by the time her parents got there and encountered this man, meaning he was there doing all sorts of nasty things for what seems to be a very long period of time.
Here he is doing this in the first place to anyone, let alone someone with special needs. But now we have this added ick factor of long after she's dead, he's there apparently engaging in necrophilia with her. Now you have this mirror that he's got in front of the bed, and police think that he was watching himself doing this. It's almost out of like a scene out of American Psycho. There's a memorable scene like that in that movie that reminds me a little bit of this. It's really disturbing. And I can't imagine how terrified Jodi was at the end of her life with this guy doing this to her.
Arthur gave a description of the man he had seen in Jodi's room, which was used to create a composite sketch. Arthur described the man as chubby and at least 5'8" to 6 feet tall. Unfortunately, Arthur, in his haste to back out of the room quickly, didn't get a real good look at the man, and he had only caught a glimpse since the bedroom light was off and the windows had been covered by blankets. Arthur didn't just give a description of the man he saw, he also told investigators the name of a man he believed it could have been. Art believed it could have been a man named Robert Burns. Robert was an acquaintance of Jodi's and was also developmentally disabled. They had multiple appointments and activities together and would often run into each other at the bus stop.
Police quickly zeroed in on Robert Burns, and almost immediately he was arrested and questioned. Unfortunately, Arthur and the police were wrong. They had a DNA profile from the killer, and Robert Burns' DNA did not match the killer's. Surveillance footage from a bus in the Escondido area also proved that Robert wasn't even in the area when Jodi's father walked in on the killer. It just couldn't have been him. It was a letdown for both police and Jodi's parents, who were hoping for a quick resolution in the case. Unfortunately, despite having an eyewitness who saw the killer, as well as that person's DNA, there wouldn't be a quick resolution, and the case went cold. Years later, Jodi's parents were still hoping for answers and praying that the man who murdered Jodi wouldn't strike again. In 2011, Jodi's father Arthur told the San Diego Union Tribune that their number one concern was to get the monster off the streets.
Obviously, Jodi's murder forever changed the holiday. For Arthur and Lois Serrin, each Valentine's Day following her murder, Art and Lois would take a trip together, trying to escape their memories of that day in 2007. They wanted to be anywhere but in Carlsbad, where their daughter was brutally murdered, and who can blame them? The last time they celebrated that holiday in Carlsbad, the night ended with finding Jodi dead. It would understandably be hard to feel romantic on that day, especially in the same area. And add to that the fact that they still didn't know who was responsible. That person could be anywhere.
There were no strong leads in Jodi's case for years, and fingerprints and DNA continued to be a dead end because there were no matches in the system. By 2015, investigators were running the DNA from the scene through the database every week, hoping that one day there would be a match. Her parents began to wonder if an answer would ever come. Lois Serrin told the San Diego Union Tribune, "This monster could be dead, and we will never know." It seemed hopeless to Jodi's parents at times, but police never gave up trying to solve Jodi's case. On the 10th anniversary of her murder, there was a renewed effort to bring the case to the public's attention in the media.
Parabon Nanolabs released a composite image of what the suspect could look like based on his DNA profile. Then forensic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter worked with the YSTR from the DNA sample to find the suspect's male lineage, and her efforts paid off. She ended up finding the killer's family tree and came up with the last name Mabrito, which led investigators to a suspect with that last name. In 2018, an evidence swab from the crime scene was retested against samples from family members of that new suspect. And this time, there was a definitive match to the suspect. His name was David Aaron Mabrito.
Sadly, David Mabrito would never be held accountable for killing Jodi because he had died in January 2011. That year, he was caught up in a traffic stop and matched the description of the suspect in a bank robbery and was compelled to give his DNA for comparison or be arrested because of how suspicious saying no would look. Just a week after this traffic stop, Mabrito died of a drug overdose that police believed was a suicide. He had lived with the secret of murdering Jodi for almost 4 years, but an encounter with law enforcement just before his suicide required that he give up a sample of his DNA. He likely knew that once his DNA was in the system, he could be linked to Jodi's murder and held accountable for it. Luckily, police held on to that DNA sample he had given, and it was later used to confirm he was Jodi's killer.
And Morf, you and I did a whole season on cases that were solved using forensic genealogy. I mean, I continue to be amazed at what some of this technology can do. Obviously, we've talked about Parabon Nanolabs a lot over the years. They've kind of been at the forefront for a lot of this stuff. You know, amazing to me that we can now get an image of what a person might look like simply based on a DNA profile. And then obviously the forensic genealogy side of things is being used to great effect, right? To solve cases, running down family trees, finding the killer through that family tree. I mean, it's really compelling stuff.
Yeah, it seems sometimes we take it for granted now because it's just so commonplace that we see so many cases being solved weekly. And I remember when this first came out, when this first started happening, these solves, it was like so revolutionary and new and exciting. And even before that, when they were just able to do these Parabon snapshots of, what the person looked like, a sketch based on their genetic makeup, that was groundbreaking at the time. But now we don't even need that. We can just use the genealogy to catch these bad guys. So it's great to see this is all advancing, and who knows if they can do all this now, 5-10 years down the road, they might be able to do even more groundbreaking stuff.
Well, I'm sure they're going to, right? Technology always advances. We don't know what the next big thing will be, but I'm sure it's going to lead to even more cold cases being solved. And to me, that's just exciting stuff. Now, the downside is that a lot of the time, once they figure out who the killer is, that person is already dead and cannot be held accountable. And there is some sadness in that for me. But the good news is that the family at least gets answers after, a number of years.
Do you have $10,000 or more in credit card debt? Maybe you're even barely getting by making minimum payments. With credit card debt hitting record highs, National Debt Relief offers real debt relief solutions for people struggling to keep up. These options may reduce a large portion of credit card debt for those who qualify. You don't need to declare bankruptcy, and you may be able to pay back less than you owe, regardless of your credit. National Debt Relief has already reduced the credit card debt for more than 550,000 consumers. So don't wait. If you owe 10, 20, or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in credit card debt, you can now take advantage of this financial debt relief as the cost of living increases. To find out how much you could save, visit nationaldebtrelief.com. That's nationaldebtrelief.com.
On June 11, 1998, a deputy from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department went missing.
Hey, if they'll kill a cop and bury him, what are they going to do to me?
What really happened to the missing deputy? Valley of Shadows, a new series from Pushkin Industries about crime and corruption in California's high desert.
Listen to Valley of Shadows wherever you get your podcasts.
So finally, after 11 years, Jodi's parents had answers, and the monster that they worried about striking again had been off the street for years. Carlsbad Police Chief Neil Gallucci told NBC7 San Diego, "We never forgot Jodi, and we're grateful to have identified the person responsible for her tragic murder. Marissa and Dylan Mabrito, David Mabrito's ex-wife, and their son were actually honored with a Citizens of Courage Award from the San Diego District Attorney's Office for their help in the investigation by voluntarily giving up their own DNA samples to compare against the sample from Jodi's murder. At the time, Dylan was just 14 years old. And, Morf, this had to have really shaken him up and left him with a lot of questions. He told NBC7, "You can't really explain how it feels when you realize it's your dad." Lois and Arthur Serrin were actually concerned about how Dylan took the news and how he was doing after learning about what his father had done. The two families met and wanted to keep in touch despite the difficult circumstances that brought them together. Art Serrin passed away in April of 2024. It appears that Lois is still alive. And sometimes, you have very heartwarming moments in what to this point has been a really horrific case. I think this just shows you what kind of people we're dealing with here. Art and Lois being worried about Dylan. I mean, imagine what type of compassion people have to be worried about the son of their daughter's killer. I mean, it just gives me chills a little bit to think about it. And then I think you also have to really give props to, Marissa and Dylan for voluntarily cooperating with police.
Yeah, I think all around, as you just mentioned, these are some good people. You've got two people connected to the killer that are willing to help by giving their DNA. And then you have Jodi's parents accepting of this other family that's hurting because they found out their husband and father is a murderer, but yet they still sort of welcome them and care about what happens to them. It's just a good story all around this part of it, that these people were, through these awful circumstances, connected and, seem to care about what happens to one another. It's still unclear how David Mabrito and Jodi knew each other, if they even did, though there are a few guesses. Mabrito was a transient, and Jodi was an active volunteer at multiple local nonprofit organizations, at the San Diego Humane Society, and at her church. It's possible that they somehow crossed paths while she was volunteering and he was receiving services somewhere. It's also possible that they met on the beach. Jodi was described as someone who loved long walks on the beach, and Mabrito and his ex-wife Marissa met each other on the beach. Lieutenant Corrin told the San Diego Union Tribune, "The nature of the relationship and how they cross paths is unfortunately gone with the people that are involved."
For Jodi's parents, Arthur and Lois, The long wait was painful, but they finally got answers thanks to the DNA. It came while they were both still alive, and not years or decades after Jodi's family was long gone, as we sometimes see. And I think, for me, there's some solace in that, right? That Jodi's parents got to find out while they were both still alive. Because, let's face it, some of these cold cases that are solved, they go on 20, 30, 40, 50, even 60 years. And key family members, by the time the case is solved, often have passed away, which means they died without ever knowing what happened to their loved one.
Yeah, we talked about how they initially were skeptical of the case ever being solved and maybe lost a little bit of hope along the way. But thankfully, the police kept plugging away and used those advancements in DNA science to have a resolution in this case. So her family did get those answers, even if the person that did it was already dead and couldn't face justice.
And earlier we talked about a man named Robert Burns. It seemed to me, at least from the standpoint of Arthur, that, he gave out this guy, Robert Burns, as a possible suspect. And you always wonder what that does to somebody who we now know wasn't responsible for Jodi's death, but how long did they have to live with this kind of cloud of suspicion, right, hanging over them? That's got to be really tough.
And just as tough, wanting the answer, giving a person's name like that, Arthur was probably hoping that would be the guy, and it wasn't. But I imagine that he had some guilt, even though he shouldn't have. He probably felt some guilt over the years after not stopping that guy when he saw him, and he couldn't have saved his daughter. But I still think that he probably had wrestled for years with, what if I had stopped him? Would it have made a difference? Could the police have arrested him right away? And then we would have, had an answer right away. So, I wonder how that affected him the rest of his life.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I think a lot of people are forced to live in the wake of this type of situation with guilt, whether it's survivor's guilt because someone lived, but somebody else died. In this case, the parents. So often I imagine there's guilt when there really shouldn't be, but it's inevitable, right? You can tell yourself, well, there's no way I could have known, but it's not going to stop the guilt from seeping in, I imagine.
Yeah, I'm just glad that eventually Jodi's case was resolved and her family maybe found some peace in that. And we know who did this to this poor woman, and, she can rest in peace, hopefully. So the first case we talked about, Jodi Serrin's, was solved and her family got answers. But the next case we're discussing, Carolyn Eaton's, remains unsolved. And sadly, her mom passed away, not just waiting to find out who had killed Carolyn, but where she even was, because Carolyn's case started off as a missing persons case. 17-year-old Carolyn Eaton was last seen at around 3 o'clock in the morning on February 4th, 1982, though at that time, no one knew that the young girl they were looking at was Carolyn. She was spotted with an older male truck driver at the Monte Carlo truck stop in Ash Fork, Arizona. The age gap between them, she was clearly just a teenager, and the man looked to be in his 50s, as well as the extremely early or late hour, made her stand out to Patty Wilkins, who was working as a waitress there at the truck stop that was owned by her family. She actually asked the young girl if she was okay and told her that she was welcome to stay at the truck stop if she wanted to. But the girl basically said everything was fine and stayed with the truck driver she had arrived with.
The man ordered breakfast for himself, but the girl was suffering from a severe toothache, so she couldn't eat anything. She ordered only water. It seemed to upset the man that he couldn't help her pain. So Patty actually stepped in. She crushed up a baby aspirin tablet and put the powder on the tooth that was hurting the girl, hoping it would at least dull the pain for her. It was a tooth on the lower left side of her mouth. After that, the young girl and the truck driver left. For Patty, it was just like plenty of other people she saw passing through the truck stop. That was until 10 days later, on February 14th. That day, an Arizona state trooper was searching an area along Interstate 40, not far from the truck stop, because a tire had rolled off of a truck and gone off the road. While he was looking for the tire, he discovered something else altogether. The body of a young girl, about 25 feet off the westbound side of the highway, face down underneath a cedar tree. Wildlife had begun to tear and eat at the body, so it was no doubt a disturbing sight.
Investigators combed the scene near where the girl's body was found, looking for clues. The belt loops of the girl's jeans were torn and led investigators to believe that her killer had used them to drag her to the spot where he left her. Her bra and a red and white sweater were found near the body. It's unclear if they had been removed or if they had come off while she was being dragged. One odd thing was that the dead girl had a wadded-up chunk of aspirin wedged between her teeth. There was no identification with the girl's body, and no one knew who she was. She didn't match any missing persons reports from the area. Because she was found on Valentine's Day, she was given the name Valentine Sally. Police circulated sketches and a description of the girl they had dubbed Valentine Sally, and upon hearing the news, Patty Wilkins immediately felt the girl they had found was the same one she had interacted with, and she went to police, who confirmed her suspicion.
Police asked Patty to recount every detail that she could for them. She recalled that the man at the truck stop had been wearing a brown leather vest and a cowboy hat with a peacock feather in it. He was white and about 5 feet 10 inches tall with a medium build. Patty told them that the pair seemed to be comfortable with each other and that there was no reason at the time for her to suspect that there was any cause for concern. Investigators believed the girl had been hitchhiking and that the man Patty saw her with had picked her up somewhere along the way.
Another person, a young man, came forward and claimed he had given Valentine Sally a ride on February 2nd. He picked her up nearly 2 hours south of Ashfork, and she mentioned to him during the ride that she had started her trip from Phoenix, which is another hour south of where he picked her up. He recalled that the girl had told him she had been working as a dishwasher and lived with some of her friends, but was heading to New Jersey. Her plan was to make it to Flagstaff, where she would ask someone at the Little America truck stop for a ride to the East Coast.
Ash Fork is just about 50 miles west of Flagstaff. The area where her body was found was halfway between Ash Fork and Flagstaff. She had nearly made it there, but something went really wrong, and she never made it to her destination. Investigators believe it happened quite soon after she had been at the truck stop, where she interacted with Patty, since the wadded-up aspirin had not fully dissolved yet. It was believed she died very soon after Patty saw her on February 4th. The medical examiner also noted that the tooth that had been hurting the girl had been prepared for a root canal up to a week before she was killed. Authorities were unable to determine what had actually killed the girl due to the level of decomposition and the animal activity. Assuming the day of her death was correct, it had been nearly 2 weeks before her body was discovered. Their best guess, based on the absence of certain wounds, was that she was strangled or suffocated.
So police had no idea who the victim was or the killer. They felt that if they could play out what happened, that it might lead to more answers. There were a few scenarios that could explain the girl's murder. The first was that the man seen with her was trying to gain the girl's trust, which is why he was being so nice when Patty spotted them together and seemed concerned for her toothache and wasn't acting creepy. He could have made a sexual advance, and when he was rejected, it made him angry. The second scenario is that tension just started running high. The man could have been very tired from driving on the road, and the girl was probably not feeling well due to the pain she was in. Maybe this is one of those heat-of-the-moment cases where someone just snapped and it had deadly consequences. But dragging her 25 feet off the highway and leaving her face down partially clothed doesn't really seem like it was a heat-of-the-moment crime. It seems like she may have been attacked, and that there might have been a sexual component. It's interesting that she was found off the westbound side of the highway, but she was trying to head east. This could point toward a situation where maybe the man started going the wrong way, and she knew he had bad intentions and started trying to get away from him.
Police wondered if Valentine Sally's killer could be a serial killer. He had killed her and gotten away with it. He could easily have more undiscovered victims. It was a very frightening scenario. There is a convicted criminal and suspected serial killer who was known to wear a large cowboy hat that was decorated with some kind of ornate feather. His name is Royal Russell Long. He was known to be active in Wyoming, Oklahoma, South Dakota, and New Mexico. There's a gap in his known activity that Valentine Sally's murder would fit right into. However, the crime he was convicted of involved kidnapping 2 young girls and holding them at his home. Most of the other crimes he's suspected of being responsible for also involve 2 girls being abducted in the same incident. He also had a very thick beard and mustache and wore pretty large glasses. Royal Russell Long has a very distinct look. It seems likely that if Patty was shown a photo of him, she would have recognized him. The sketch we do have of the suspect appears to depict a man who's older than Royal Russell Long with no facial hair or glasses.
2 years after her death, investigators believe that Valentine Sally had been identified. Her physical appearance and her dental records appeared to match those of 14-year-old Melody Cutlip, who had been reported missing from Istichata, Florida in 1980. Melody's mother, who reported her daughter missing, refused to claim the body of Valentine Sally because she didn't think it was really Melody. But investigators, with no evidence, and despite Melody's own mom declining to say Valentine Sally was Melody, pressed on, and Melody's name was added to a gravestone marking Valentine Sally's grave. And Patty Wilkins had even paid for her burial and headstone, which simply read Valentine. But investigators got a real curveball when in 1986, Melody Cutlip returned home, alive and well. She was 20 years old by that time. Her mother had been right. Valentine Sally was not Melody. Someone else out there was still missing their daughter, wondering where she could be and when she'd be home. Investigators were back to square one, and the case didn't move for years.
And to me, Morf, this was a very strange, scenario. You have a Jane Doe. Obviously, authorities want to identify this person, and they believe she could be this Melody Cutlip. But even though Melody's mother is adamant that Valentine Sally is not Melody, they go ahead and basically name her, even going to the point of adding her name to the headstone.
Yeah, and I wonder if that came down to a case of the police just thinking that Melody's mom was in denial and, she didn't want to come to the realization that her daughter was dead, but, she seemed to know her own daughter and said that's not her, and she turned out to be right. So that's something we don't see a lot, this kind of thing where the person comes back and, as we mentioned, that really threw a curveball into things.
Answers as to the true identity of Valentine Sally finally came just after Valentine's Day in 2021. Investigators used forensic genetic genealogy to track down any potential relatives of the yet unidentified Valentine Sally. They were able to find her first cousin, who was living in the St. Louis area of Missouri, and that quickly led to some progress. 40 years after she died, investigators were able to confirm that Valentine Sally was actually 17-year-old Carolyn Celeste Eaton. She ran away from her Bellefontaine neighbors' Missouri home around Christmas time in 1981 after an argument with her family. She was one of 6 daughters, born to Donald and Ela Eaton. Somehow, at some point, she made it to Ash Fork, Arizona, about 1,400 miles west. Tom Taylor, a missing persons detective from St. Louis County, told the St. Louis Dispatch, "It's an absolute reminder that hope springs eternal for police investigators and someone with a missing family member." Patty Wilkins, who never forgot her brief interaction with Carolyn, was very emotional when Carolyn was identified, telling WSOC TV, "It's like one of my girls." She may not have been Carolyn's family, but she has spent years caring deeply about the girl she feels she let walk out the door and to her death. She also said, "I could have done a million different things that I didn't do. I could have pulled her off that truck. I could have forced her to stay with me. I could have called 911. Patty had regularly called the police when it looked like a runaway teen was passing through, but Carolyn wasn't alone, and Patty had no way to know she had run away from home or that she had just met the man she was with.
You really have to feel bad for Patty. It's clear that she's felt some guilt for what happened to Carolyn, despite her not being at fault at all. And she's thought of Carolyn for all these years. But Patty did try. She asked Carolyn directly if she was okay. She offered her a place to stay if she didn't feel safe with the man. I don't think there's much more she could have done. Maybe writing down the man's license plate number and details about his vehicle, but even doing that still likely wouldn't have saved Carolyn since she was killed so soon after Patty saw her. News of Carolyn being identified was welcomed by Patty, who had always felt a connection to her years after she was killed. She told WSOC TV, "It's only been me and her, but now she's got a family. Isn't that great? It doesn't get any better. I love you, and I'm glad you're going home."
And we talked in the earlier case, Morf, about guilt, right? And I do believe there's guilt, or the feeling of guilt. Whether or not that person should feel it, that's a different question. But here you have a woman in Patty who had what obviously was a pretty brief interaction with this girl who later wound up dead, but it stuck with her. It was part of her life for so many years, if not for her entire life. It just goes to show you what these types of events can do to people, what effect they can have on people.
Yeah, and Patty, she tried to sort of offer help if the girl needed it. She turned her down. She also didn't see anything troubling, any clear sign that, Carolyn was in trouble when she was in the truck stop. So, what else could she have done? Short of grabbing her and saying, "You're not going with this guy." And why would she do that? That just wouldn't happen because there was nothing there that stood out to her. So, we talk about guilt and feeling it all those years, and it's clear Patty did, but I think most people would agree she has no reason to feel guilty.
And if Patty was feeling guilty about not doing more to help the girl she only saw one morning at work for a short time, I would imagine that Carolyn's family had been living with a lot of guilt over the situation too. As far as anyone knew, Carolyn was so upset that she left her home and never came back. She never reached out. They must have wondered at least once whether something bad had happened to her and whether they could have done or said anything differently that last time they saw her. Maybe they thought she was out there the whole time, just unwilling to see them. One thing, though, is for sure. Her mom died without ever finding out what happened to Carolyn.
So now one part of this mystery is solved, and Carolyn has her name back. But one name the police are still seeking is the man she was last seen with, her presumed killer. If you have any information about the murder of Carolyn Eaton, you can contact the Coconino County Sheriff's Office at 800-338-7888. Maybe you know something about who the man she was last seen with could have been. A truck driver who wore a felt cowboy hat decorated with peacock feathers, was fond of wearing vests, and would have traveled through northern Arizona in the early 1980s.
And I do think, more if there are some, kind of unique identifiers there. But again, 1980s, what are we talking about? 40 years? 40 plus years? It's possible that someone could have some information. But I do want to talk a little bit about, truck drivers. We have covered truck driving serial killers. There have been quite a few of them. Now, let's face it, driving kind of a long haul trucking route in and of itself kind of lends to the ability, if one were so inclined, number one, in the 80s to be able to pick up someone pretty easily, right? A lot of people were hitchhiking. We know that. And then I think secondly, you're moving around so much that back during that time frame, at least, it would have been a lot tougher to track someone's movements. I think some of that has changed today with GPS and the tracking that a lot of these trucks have. But in the 1980s, I don't know how some of this stuff was tracked, if it was at all.
Yeah, it was definitely a dangerous time hitchhiking. And then you have truck drivers that, there's trucks all over the place. And, if somebody wanted to be a predator and pick up a young girl that was hitchhiking, it would be easy to take them to a whole nother location. They could disappear anywhere along the way. And, I think back then there probably were some missing young girls that were victims of truck driving killers. I think overwhelmingly most truck drivers that I've dealt with, that I've heard stories about, that I've talked to, I think most truck drivers are the opposite. They see a young girl on the road. They want to help them. They want to give them a ride to keep them safe. Maybe they think of their daughter, their wife, their sister. So I think overwhelmingly most truck drivers are going to help a young girl in need, not harm them. But we know that some predators were mixed into that bunch of truck drivers.
Yeah, no doubt you're right. I mean, you could look at any profession and say, well, by and large, most people in that profession are, they're good people. They want to do the right thing. But in every profession, there are some people who decide, they want to break the law, or they want to be killers. There's really no profession that's immune from that. And we've covered a lot of them, from truck drivers to doctors. But, there are some similarities in these two cases. We talked about guilt. I think that's kind of universal between cases where someone involved is going to feel guilt, even if they really have nothing to feel guilty about. And I think Patty fits that mold for sure. The second thing that really jumped out at me is, in the differences between the two cases, obviously one is solved and one is unsolved. And you can really kind of see the impact in that difference, right? One family gets answers and another one doesn't.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of bittersweet because especially in Carolyn's case, she's eventually identified. So at the very least, her remaining family has that, but they still don't know who killed her, and they may never find out. And that's got to be very tough to know that they may never know who did this.
And then you have the common connection of Valentine's Day, right? So you have, for two sets of friends, families, horrific cases that will forever be connected with that day. There's just no way around it. That day was changed for so many people connected with these two victims. But that's it for our episode on the Valentine's Day mysteries. As always, if you love the show, but you haven't done so yet, take a minute, go out, leave us a review. You can give us a rating, but also keep telling your friends. Word of mouth about the podcast really goes a long way.
If you want to find us on social media, we're on every major platform. Just search for Criminology Podcast on your favorites. You can also go to our website, criminologypodcast.com, to check out news about the show and old episodes. And if you want to join a discussion group about the podcast and the cases we discuss, head over to Facebook and search for Criminology Podcast Discussion and Fans.
So that's it for another episode of Criminology, but Morf and I will be back with all of you next Saturday night with a brand new episode. So until then, for Mike
and Morf,
we'll talk to you next week.
Take care, everyone.